This podcast is brought to you by the Islamic Center and NYU. For more information, visit our website at www.icnyu.org.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع نفوسنا حبيب إله العالمين الذي سمع في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآل محمد. In light of us still being in the days of Rabi al-Awwal, it's an opportunity for us to reflect upon the character and the legacy and the life of our Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Not such, of course, that we need an excuse to remember him sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, but rather because of the blessings of these days and perhaps a responsibility for us to consistently grow in our relationship with him sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I thought to talk a little bit about some of the etiquettes of the Prophet alayhi salam, such that we can hopefully take some practical benefit and lesson from it. Of course, within the whole Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, إِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. That when he talks about the character and the nature of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he states that, O Messenger of God, surely you have great character. And the word that he employs is azim. And the word azim, interestingly enough, is the same word that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala utilizes toward explaining the Quran, kitabun azim. The same word that he utilizes toward explaining the last day, the day of judgment, yawmun azim. The same day or the same word that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala utilizes to explain himself, for surely he is azim, azza wa jal. But he also employs this particular term towards speaking to the unique character of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And it's not sufficient that we only speak to the merit of the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam by speaking about verses of the Quran that mention his unique station in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather in order for us to recognize that there's a practical benefit in remembering him alayhi salam and his character in the way that we seek toward walking in those sacred footsteps of his. In other words, that we know the way that he would act, his interpersonal dealings, his relationships with others, the way that he would communicate with others, such that we can take lesson from it and hopefully manifest and reflect some of that etiquette during the course of our lives. But before I get there, how do we define akhlaq or khuluq in the first place? When you come to Islamic ethics, there's a strong stress, of course, on perfecting one's etiquette, on perfecting one's character. إِنَّمَا بُئِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمْ مَكَارِمُ الْأَخْلَاقِ. As the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it states that surely I was sent down, and when we state in the Arabic language, the word إِنَّمَا is an exclusive sort of statement whereby he states that exclusively my responsibility, my job, is to perfect the character of my community, is to allow for ourselves to reach a higher state in terms of our relationship with ourselves, in terms of our relationship with others, and by extension, our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can all have good adab, we can all have good akhlaq, but the idea is to consistently elevate that experience for others in terms of their dealings and interactions with us. Let me give you an example. The same word adab, which is again also sort of interchangeably used with character, is also a term historically in the Arabic language that was used toward emphasizing a really beautiful and positive experience when it comes to something as simple as eating. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're really, really hungry, you're starving. It's the month of Ramadan or otherwise. When you're hungry, the only thing that your mind is preoccupied with is food. You're not concerned about anything else, particularly when you're starving. which is why normally when someone eats, and when they're very, very hungry, they eat really, really quickly. They eat really fast. And that's, of course, not good for them. But nonetheless, because our minds are only thinking and our bodies are only salivating over the food that we're about to eat. In order to perfect or beautify that experience, what will we do? We'd make sure that everything is ready in order for me to eat my meal and in a state of enjoyment. Let's say you order food and you're waiting for it to come. In the meantime, you're going to get everything ready. You're going to get your table ready. You're going to get your utensils ready. You're going to get your drink ready so that when the food comes, you're ready to eat. You keep the spoon and the fork on the right side, the knife on the left side, and you fill up your glass with water or with whatever drink you're about to drink. You're getting everything prepared for that experience of food and indulging in the meal. Preparing for that experience or perfecting that experience is adab when it comes toward food. Again, it's about perfecting or reaching the highest pinnacle of that experience. This example when it comes to food, but when it comes toward our interactions and our dealings with others, the idea is also to perfect our experience and consistently grow in that state. So when we go and we read, for instance, these ahadith about the Prophet's sort of characteristics, before we even talk about his personality, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we're going to often hear that the Prophet alayhi salam, he would smell always with a really sort of attractive fragrance. That the Prophet alayhi salam had always his hair and his beard well kept. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would always dress in clean clothes, for instance. And we hear these things, and sometimes people say, like, what is the big deal, or what is the lesson that we're trying to derive from it? I'm telling you that the lesson that we're seeking from it is that an external, physical personality or experience of someone demonstrates more likely than not something internal as well. So when it says that the Prophet ﷺ has a pleasant face and he puts on this cheerful smile, as these ahadith tell us when people describe how the Prophet ﷺ looked, it's because people were always drawn to his physical, because internally, spiritually, there was something that allowed for them to connect with him, alayhi salatu wasalam. There are plenty of people who are well kept, so to say, or that put on a lot of nice fragrances, but when you look at their face or when you're in their presence, you don't feel comforted. When we talk about the physical, it's important to understand that there's a spiritual beneath that. And that is the important sort of phase of akhlaq and etiquette and adab that we're talking about. It's not only performing the ritual externally, it's about cultivating an internal spiritually. You follow what I'm saying? So when we talk about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's someone who internally had purified himself, alayhi salatu wasalam. Thus, that energy or that beauty from his etiquette, from his akhlaq, exuded externally. And that's what it's all about. So I'm going to read to you a narration as reported by Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, as narrated in Nahj al-Balagha, sermon number 160, whereby he describes the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you're going to see how externally his etiquette and his interactions with others was truly a demonstration of where his heart was. He states, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, of course, the close confidant, cousin, son-in-law of the Prophet alayhi salam, he states, so follow your Prophet, the noble, the pure. He took the least share from this world and did not take a full glance at it. Of all of the people of the world, he was the least sated, he was the least satiated, and the most empty of stomach. What do we learn from this? Of course, someone could say that, okay, I also don't eat a lot, or I also fast regularly. Again, what we're speaking when it comes toward the Prophet ﷺ is that he is someone who, though he recognized the importance of physical interaction, like we talked about, keeping your hair well done, or your beard, or dressing in a certain way, or having a fragrance, or bathing regularly, all of these things that hopefully we're all doing anyway, it was not out of the hope of impressing anyone, but it was out of the demonstration that I can do all of those things, but this world doesn't consume me still. You follow? He stated, when he knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hated a thing, he also hated it. And when he knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discouraged something, he would also discourage it. And when he knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saw something as insignificant or small, he also held it insignificant or small. And then Ali says, and if we love what Allah and His Prophet hate and hold great what Allah and His Prophet hold small, that would be enough of an isolation from God and of His Prophet. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So again, the idea is to demonstrate what is done externally so that we're walking in those footsteps. He continues. He states that the Prophet ﷺ used to eat on the ground and he sat like a slave. Again, recognizing the insignificance of this world, of the dunya. You know, in the Arabic language, the word dunya comes from the root word dana. You guys know what dana means? Dana means something very close or something very low or something very insignificant. So this world, the dunya, is meant to being something insignificant, something passing, something transient. And consistently reminding ourselves of that is really, really important. What are the ways that we remind ourselves of that? So again, when you're sitting down to eat, like the way that the Prophet ﷺ would, or you hear a hadith from somebody saying that the Prophet ﷺ, he would always sit down on the floor and eat. Someone says, I do that culturally as well. It's not about what is done culturally. It's about the intention behind it and what's over here. The reason why he sat that way was to be uncomfortable in something that is meant to be pleasing, eating, right? Like we talked about before. But in the world of the Prophet, in the mind and in the heart of the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he didn't see sitting down and eating as this really important sort of, step for his digestion or whatever other people give. And that's fine. Those are also maybe sort of external benefits. But he wanted to demonstrate to those around him and to us, alayhi salatu wasalam, that the idea behind sitting on the floor and eating is to reject the pleasure of something that is meant to be pleasurable, because that would allow for him to be consumed with the world even for a moment. I'm not saying that we have to all of a sudden reject the world entirely and abstain from it. But the idea is that we're working towards seeing the big picture. The Prophet ﷺ used to sit on the ground and he sat like a slave. He repaired his shoes with his own hands and patched his clothes with his own hands. Not because he didn't have any wealth again, but because he wanted to humble himself. It's said that one day, Jesus ﷺ, Nabiullah Isa, son of Mary, he was sitting with a group of his students, his disciples. And he would go and he would wash their feet. One day he was in a company with them. He brought a bucket of water and he began to scrub their feet and clean them. And they look at him, they're saying, like, what are you doing? You are Jesus, the son of Mary. You are a prophet. You are a leader. Why are you doing this? He says, for two reasons. Number one, I want to humble you and I want to show you that I'm willing to do this for you. But number two, because I want to humble myself in front of God. To demonstrate that, I do not see myself as higher than anybody, even though he's the representative of God on earth. He's the Prophet. He is Khalifatullah fi ardh, fi zamanah. Again, this idea of humility is really, really important in the lives of the prophets and the messengers. He rode on an unsaddled donkey and would seat someone behind him, meaning he would be uncomfortable even when he's riding. The idea, again, is not that we're always uncomfortable, but again, to remember the intention behind. To say that this pleasure, that this experience that may be pleasurable is also meant to be transient, is also meant to be passing. And the idea is how we're going to feed these hearts. He continues, Imam Ali alayhi salam, describing the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And he states, if there was a curtain on his door with pictures on it, he would say to one of his wives, take this picture away from my sight. Because when I look at it, I recall the world and its allurements. When you see something attractive, you can get consumed with it. When you walk around in New York City, you can get consumed with wealth, you can get consumed with power, you can get consumed with materialism or things. The idea is, once in a while, it's important to step away. it's important to step away and reevaluate and again see that this world is something that's transient. Lest he distance his heart from this world and removed its remembrance from his mind. He wished that its allurement should remain hidden from his eyes so as not he feels the desire to take wealth from it, nor regard it as a place to stay and hope to live in it. That when we become attached to it, that's the danger. Hub ad-dunya ra'su kullu khati'ah, as the famous statement from Ali alayhi salam states, that love of this world is the height of all sin and transgression. When we are so infatuated with this world, that's the cause of every single sin. Because again, we wish to feed the body, wish to feed our body and not these hearts of ours. So he removed it from his mind, distanced it from his heart, and kept it hidden from his eyes, just as he who hates a thing would hate to look at it or to hear about it. Meaning his only preoccupation, of course, is thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and remembering at every moment that it's transient. You get into an argument with someone, you're frustrated with somebody or a particular situation. The quickest way to get over that is to remember that this world is going to pass anyway. What's the point of me being so consumed by this person or by this relationship or by this situation if it's all going to pass anyway? And I don't mean to say that sort of cryptically or negatively. No, there are benefits to this transient world, but only when we see it as transient, then we can recognize that, yes, I can take from the moment and the experience of being in a state of enjoyment of it, but then see the bigger picture at the end of the day. The idea is to find that balance. Because like we said, the Prophet ﷺ, in spite of this, like I mentioned before, we have all of these other reports, all of these other narrations, all of these other explanations from those around him who apparently saw him ﷺ always with this cheerful face, always with a smile, always willing to spend time and socialize with others and to engage with other people. But on the flip side, someone who knows him as sort of confidently as Ali alayhi salam, he explains the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam in this way, very somber, very serious. His relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preceded his thoughts about anything else. But when you see those who might recognize the Prophet alayhi salam more casually, as the head of state, as the Prophet of God, as the leader of prayers, they would say, no, the Prophet ﷺ was always smiling. He was always happy. We have a hadith from him, sallallahu alayhi wa, in which he states, Al-mu'min khuznun fi qalbih wa bishrun ala wajhih. That the believer has a little bit of sadness in their heart, but they're always happy on their face. I mean, they might be going through certain things, or they might be so preoccupied with their own thoughts, or with their sins, or with a whole host of other things with regards to service to community. Sometimes when you're serving others like the way that the Prophet ﷺ would, he would carry on the burden of their hardships and their difficulties, the people who would come to him and speak to him and complain to him and so on. But he would not allow for that to come in the way of his interactions with those around him. And again, it all starts over here in the heart, and then we can be victorious externally as well. I'll give you this last example. Maybe you've heard this story before. Of the story of this one boy, it's probably, 7 or 8, 9 years old. And he was playing with this friend of his with a particular toy or a book or whatever it was. And this friend of his came to him and told him that, I want you to give me this toy. And this 8, 9-year-old boy, he said, no, it's mine. So he says, no, you should share. I really want it. You know, kids, they always do this type of things, right? Just share with me, but they really want it for themselves. So he says, no, I don't want to. And he takes it and he walks away and he goes back home. As he enters into his home, he sees his grandfather sitting down. His grandfather recognizes that he's a little bit distressed. So he goes to his 8, 9-year-old grandson. And he tells him, what's wrong? He says, I was playing with my friend, whatever his name was. And I was playing with this toy. And he told me, share this toy with me. Share this toy with me because we're friends. So let me borrow it and then I'll return it back to you. And he said, at that moment, I wanted to give him the toy, but I also wanted it for myself. And I felt in my chest, I felt in my head that there was these two wolves that were fighting with one another. One which was saying, be nice and give it to your friend. And the other one that said, no, take it for yourself. Maybe you've heard this example before, right? And so he tells his grandfather, he says, what am I supposed to do when that happens? When I feel these two animals fighting in my heart? How do I make sure that I'm always making the right decision and doing the right thing? How do I know which one will be more successful? The grandfather, in his wisdom and his guidance, says it all depends on which one you feed. Are you going to feed the merciful, the compassionate, the caring? Or are you going to feed the one that's only concerned with power and dominance and authority? That's not to say that the kid made the wrong decision. It was his. But when we're in moments of conflict consistently during the course of our lives, the conflict of right versus wrong, the conflict of justice versus injustice, the conflict of letting it go or pursuing it, the conflict of being merciful or compassionate or judgmental or wrathful, that conflict is something that builds up to a larger conflict later on during the course of our lives. And at every moment and at every juncture, we feed the power, we feed the authority or the desire for all of those things. At the end of the day, that ability to be merciful and to be compassionate and to be just and to be empathetic and to be sincere and to be be compassionate or caring, it gets dominated because you kept on feeding it. What we learn from the life and from the legacy and from the message and from the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that at every battle and at every juncture and at every opportunity, when it came to himself, he would make sure to choose that wolf, so to say, of empathy, of sincerity, of compassion. But when it came towards supporting others, he would make sure to feed the one of power, of defense, of standing against the injustice. Meaning there has to be some sense of balance during the course of our lives. Through this glimpse of this report and this tradition we read again, Ali alayhi salam, he explains the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam as someone who was completely sort of in a state of abstinence of this dunya. But then again, like we said, on the flip side, when you hear other explanations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you would see him as someone who was perfectly engaged with those around him and with society and with community. The idea is to find the state of what I like to call spiritual equilibrium, so to say, where your state of recognition of the heart knows that I'm working toward getting closer toward God at every moment. But at the same time, we have to live in this world. How do you find that balance? How do you know what steps to take and when to step back? That's the struggle. That's the purpose. That through reflecting on the Holy Quran, on the legacy of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his family, through prayers and through supplication and through God's remembrance in spaces like these and on days like these, it's meant to give us the inspiration to making sure that we are feeding our hearts and our souls adequately and appropriately, such that it allows for the energy to exert more positively in the way that it should toward God on those days and on those moments when we need it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Allahumma salli wa sallam wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi Muhammad.
If you would like to listen to more, please donate to www.icnyu.org/donate. For more of our virtual programs, go to www.icnyu.org/classes. If you have any questions, email us at info@icnyu.org.